And hello there, Peter Mansbridge here. You are just moments away from the latest episode of The Bridge. It is Wednesday, and that clearly means smoke, mirrors, and the truth. And that means Bruce Anderson is back. And hello there, Peter Mansbridge here in Stratford, Ontario today. And look who's back. Yes, he is. And he's gone full Scotland on us. Bruce Anderson, he's been off for the last week. But look at the guy. Just look at him if you're watching us on our YouTube channel. He's got the full Scotland outfit, and he's looking very...
I know that you wanted me to dress like this, and I'm comfortable enough doing it because when I dress like this, I hit a brilliant 6-iron into the breeze, nice high draw, all the things that I can't do when I dress like I do back in Canada. So maybe that's the thing you need to try when you come over here next.
You look like one of those guys in those old videos, the classic old, fantastic videos of men golfing in Scotland, because that's how they dress. Now, like usually they wear a tie as well.
That's true. That's true.
But
maybe next week.
Pardon me?
Maybe next week I'll put on a little tie for you.
Yeah. Now,
yeah.
Did you actually, like, I know you golf in the hat because I've seen you do that, but were you wearing the vest too? And that's
I have. Yeah, I have.
When you chunked that 6-iron into the air? Excuse me, when you
lofted
that 6-iron.
Clip it nice, hit the high draw into the breeze. Yeah. No, I do.
That's good.
Sometimes.
That's good.
Yeah. I'll send you video.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Okay, let's we could obviously talk about this for the whole show, but we should probably move on to things that other people might be interested in.
Right.
There were hearings in Washington yesterday, and I know you've briefed yourself on them. There were hearings yesterday on artificial intelligence. Now, we have mentioned AI a number of times in this podcast. I think you were the first to bring it up months ago as a looming issue. And then Michelle Rempel Garner was with us for a full show a couple of months ago, and her own feeling was she's not against AI, but she says, pause, time to slow down. We got to understand the impact this is going to have. And yesterday, that seemed to be very much the feeling inside the Washington bubble. And you know what? It wasn't coming just from politicians and legislators. It was coming from some of the AI people themselves, some of the top AI people in the U.S. and, in fact, in the world. And they weren't necessarily talking about a pause, but they were talking about, hey, this stuff could used poorly or in the wrong fashion can be devastatingly bad. I think one of them said, remember when Photoshop first came out years ago, 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of concern about what Photoshop could do to photos. He said, AI is like Photoshop on steroids. We're going down a path here that, if we're not careful, can really create problems. And one of the legislators, Senator Blumenthal, played a tape, and it sounded like him talking about AI. It wasn't him. It was a fake voice created by AI with a fake script created by AI. And he was using the point to say, like, this is all very interesting right now, but can imagine this in an election campaign and what you could do to your opponent. Anyway, I'm just wondering, I found this all fascinating yesterday and reading about it again this morning. What's your feeling here? I know you were concerned months ago that we were heading in this direction. So here we are.
Yeah, I'm really glad that politicians in Washington are taking it seriously, and I'm really glad that they're doing so in a bipartisan fashion. Other than climate change, I can't imagine a more consequential set of policy choices that countries will make in the next 50 years. I think the importance of the disruption that AI will cause is really, really sweeping. And I've read something that says it will be 1,000,000 times more powerful than it is today in 10 years from now. And one can only kind of imagine what that means. It's obviously not all bad, but it's obviously the kind of thing that without some sort of regulatory parameters and guidance from a public policy standpoint, could produce some extremely difficult, challenging, and bad outcomes. What I saw in the output of the hearings yesterday was that there seemed to be three questions that were being centered on. And there's an interesting Politico article, which I tweeted today, which summarizes them. The first is an agency needed to regulate the way in which AI is used? And in America, usually that kind of question gets a lot of polarization. But interestingly, there were people like Lindsey Graham on the Republican side who were saying it's probably a good idea. And even more interesting was the fact that they seem to be saying it would be better if it was an international agency. In other words, that if it didn't only affect the use of AI within the United States, but recognize that there are global enterprises that are going to use AI, and that the implications of what they do and how they use it won't be contained by borders. And so an international agency would be a better way to approach the question of regulation if a consensus can be developed. And if it starts in the United States, I do have a feeling that the potential for it to become less problematic politically and more widely accepted as a principle, that's something. Now, of course, who knows what happens if there's a completely different administration after the next election? And don't get me started on Trump or DeSantis. But as for right now, I like the conversation yesterday. The second question that was addressed there was, who owns the data that AI trains on? So AI is a kind of a machine learning based on original content that other people have produced. But all of that content gets blended together to create something new in the hands of this, in the course of this technology being applied, which raises questions about whose original value it was, whether there's appropriate recognition or compensation for that. I don't think the world has really even begun to examine what the implications are if original content that you created could be co-opted that way and used for other purposes without any compensation to you, and what that would do to the creative market as well as the intellectual property market writ large. So another really important set of questions that nobody really has a good answer to just yet, I don't think. And then the last question, and you alluded to it in introducing the subject, Peter, is that how much will AI influence the 2024 U.S. presidential election? And the argument or the question that's being asked there is the powerful tools that can convince people that somebody said something which in fact they maybe didn't say. The potential for that to accelerate and to have an even greater impact is growing by the day, probably. And that is habitually an area where you get into the freedom of speech and let's not have more regulation conversation pretty quickly. On the other hand, weaponized AI to misinform or disinform is a risk that any politician on any part of the spectrum needs to take seriously, or at least I would say the kind of the bigger tent parties. There are probably some fringe players for whom there's no real downside, there's only upside. But that's a reason enough in and of itself, I think, to take it seriously and to figure out how to regulate it.
You talked about how AI forms based on content that's kind of all already out there, mixes various content together and then produces its own kind of original content, if you will. The problem there is there's all kinds of error potential in that. If you want to understand that, you can sign up to various AI forums, online quite easily. We did that here in our family a little while ago, and we punched in my wife's name, Cynthia Dale, and who's fairly well-known television and theater actress. And just so tell me about Cynthia Dale. And up, immediately within seconds, up pops this, 300 or 400 word uh, content piece on Cynthia. And half of it was wrong. They had her in movies she'd never appeared in. They had her on stage and things she hadn't done. They had all kinds, they had some accuracies, but they had a lot of inaccuracies. So you can see yourself the potential problem just on an error front. But then, as you talk about on the election front, the potential of the way it could be used. The other point you make, which was the interesting part of what we saw, at least certainly huge chunks of what we saw yesterday in Washington, was it was a nonpartisan event. I mentioned Blumenthal earlier, who's kind of a bit of a lightning rod at times with the Democrats, gets the Republicans really upset, sitting right beside Senator Hawley. I remember him. He was the guy with his fist in the air supporting the January 6th rioters at the beginning and then running like a scared rabbit through the place when it seemed to get out of control. So he took a lot of heat from the Democrats. But yesterday, at least in the portions I watched, the two of them were sitting side by side, nodding at each other's comments. So there is the potential there, one of the few times that we've seen it in Washington of late, where there's a nonpartisan approach. And I think that potential exists in Ottawa as well. I had a lot of nice comments about Michelle Rempel's appearance on the bridge when, from other parties who said, yeah, she's right. We've got to talk about this. Do you have a sense that they are talking about it in Ottawa?
I think there's thinking going on. I think there's policy work going on. I think there's probably a group of people in government whose job it is to kind of monitor and assess the developments in other countries and to work with different stakeholder groups to try to get a handle on it. I don't know how far along that process is. To be fair, it isn't really far along anywhere that I can see. The fact that yesterday's hearings in Washington included a range. I don't know about a whole range of opinion, but the Politico story refers to the fact that IBM's chief privacy and trust officer said existing oversight is enough and more would stifle innovation. And the reference in the piece says that that's a more familiar industry talking point. I don't think a consensus is formed. I do think that it's the politicians who are interested in looking at what policy would be smart here are not necessarily coming at it from either an ideological, more government is probably always better point of view. And most, I think, are also coming at it from the standpoint of we could stifle innovation if we overburdened machine learning and this kind of technology. And so let's not do that. But I think there is some politics likely to be ahead. In the meantime, I hope that we see continued thoughtful policy development, because that's really what we need here. We don't need policy that decides that it wants to put a finger on the ideological side of the spectrum or a political side of the spectrum. But even as I say that, I want to be careful to say that my take on the conversation about whether AI should have a bias is that it should. In other words, that if we allow AI to develop in a way that treats evil and good exactly the same, then we're going to have lots of evil, and we should probably say that that's not a good thing. And so, how do we create any kind of a bias against that without creating the kind of political polarization that we see around so many issues? I think that's the needle hole that the thread has to go through ultimately, but maybe that's a couple of years off.
It will be interesting to see how Poilievre and the Conservatives handle this. Rempel is kind of out front in her party and what she's suggesting, pause potential regulation. Poilievre is the no gatekeepers guy. And this seems to be heading towards at least some discussion about some form of gatekeeping, some form of regulation. on AI.
Well, it's good that I'm really glad that Michelle Rempel Garner did that, because I think it is important for conservative voices to weigh in on this and to identify the risks for everybody, so that it doesn't become just a question of people on the progressive side of the spectrum doing that. And it may well be that Pierre Poilievre is he's an intelligent person. He could probably well imagine what AI could do to demonize and undermine his political persona if there was no regulation of it. So I don't know that it's as easy for him to identify this as a gatekeeper issue. I could be wrong. He could decide the simplest way to handle this is just to say it's part of an agenda of people who don't, who want to control content. On the other hand, there are some days now where he is definitely, I think, making more of an effort to sound like he wouldn't flip the table over on all of the big policy issues of the day, that there are some areas where he believes that there does need to be a role for government and a more thoughtful one. Now, even as I uttered that sentence, I can feel the Twitter heat coming back at me as soon as this goes to air. So let's not get carried away there, Bruce.
But I mean, let's face it, Bruce. You love the Twitter heat. I mean, when it comes right down to it, you kind of like the Twitter heat.
No, I don't.
You like the attention.
No, I just worry that as bad as Twitter can be, AI could be a million times worse in 2 years. So we need to be careful about that.
Yeah, I don't think it'll take 2 years. Nothing takes 2 years anymore. 2 years from now, we'll be living in a totally different world. We can't even imagine what kind of technology will exist then, because things are happening so rapidly. AI
2 years is the new 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Like 2 years from now, AI
could be back on, and
AI could be that thing of the past that we talked about, Anyway, we're going to take a quick break. I want to come back. It's not really related, but it's sort of related. It's some new research that came out of the Pew Research Center in the last couple of days, which is quite interesting about the way different countries in the world are either sticking to or changing their traditions. How willing are they to embrace change? It's an interesting discussion, especially now when so many things are happening and so much changes in the air on a number of different fronts. So we'll talk about that when we come back. And welcome back. You're listening to Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth with Bruce Anderson. Bruce is in Scotland today. I'm in Stratford, Ontario. I'm Peter Mansbridge. You're listening on Sirius XM, Channel 167 Canada Talks, or on your favorite podcast platform. Or, because it's Wednesday, like Friday, we're available on our YouTube channel. So happy to have you join us on whatever platform you choose. Okay, the Pew Research Center has a pretty good name, has an excellent name, really, from researchers and journalistic organizations around the world. Pew does a lot of research into various issues that confront us as we move forward in the 21st century. It looks a lot at journalism quite often and has some interesting findings on that front. But they've just come out of a survey and some research in terms of how countries are adapting to change, who's willing to embrace it, who's willing or not willing to embrace it. So the numbers are interesting. So let me go to the numbers guy first of all, in Bruce, and get your thoughts on what we're discovering here and where we fit into the picture in terms of Canada.
Right. There are two really interesting things in this study, and I agree with you completely that anybody that likes to consume, reliable public opinion data, you'll not find a better resource than the Pew Research Center. What they did is they looked across, I think it was 17 different countries, including Canada, United States, the UK, and many others. And they asked a basic question, which is, do you think that your country will be better off in the future if it embraces and is open to change, or if it sticks to the traditions and way of life that have existed for some time. Now, in Canada and in the United States, the numbers are relatively simple on a top line basis. About 2/3 say we'll be better off as a country if we're open to change rather than stick to tradition. And that is traditionally kind of the split between more progressive thinking, more conservative minded voters in the Canadian marketplace. So it does tell us that part of the reason why we see some friction around a variety of issues, especially those that kind of fall into the diversity, inclusion, and maybe to some degree the climate change and what do we do about it issues, is that there is a natural tension that exists within our society where more people say change is good for us than say change is bad for us. But there is still a pretty sizable portion of people in Canada, about 1/3, who say we're better off not changing. Now, the second thing that this survey reveals is that how much that answer to that question of is change good for us or bad for us depends on whether somebody is on the right side of the spectrum, self-defined, or the left side of the spectrum. And in the analysis, the one chart that I tweeted out yesterday shows that the difference between people on the left in the US and people on the right in the US is massive. It's by far the biggest degree of polarization that we see anywhere on the list of all the countries that are included in it. Our gap, for example, in Canada is 52% of those on the right say change is good for us. 82% of those on the left say change is good for us. That's a pretty wide gap. That's 30 points. And that's telling us why when we have these culture war questions, left versus right is a really important dividing line. But the reason is that some people want more change and think it's good for us, and some people don't like how much change is happening. In the United States, so our gap is 30 points. In the United States, the gap is 63 points. Only 28% of those on the right in the United States say change is good for their country. 91% of those on the left in the US say change is good for their country. That is a giant fault line. That is a Grand Canyon-sized divide in opinion. And it explains a lot, I think, of what underlies the MAGA phenomena and the reaction by many people to it, and the degree of polarization that America finds itself in now.
There's so many different ways to, you can get carried away with data, and I'm sure at times you find yourself getting carried away because you see so many different surveys and research on various topics. But I love looking at a chart like this and looking at the individual countries, as you said, whether there are 17 or 20 countries in this list. But it's interesting when you separate them. The countries that seem to be most open to change are countries in the Far East. South Korea, Singapore, Australia, Malaysia, Japan. They kind of head the list of those that are most open to change, versus, the more traditional way we look at the world, which is sort of North America and Europe, and who are they're all still open to change, but nowhere near the extent to which, I should say, some countries aren't open to change. Greece is at the bottom of the list.
Greece is at the bottom of the list. Yeah. There could be a lot of reasons for that. Some cultural, some generational divides, some, will have a different definition in mind of what change means. And so I think that this research kind of hints at, a really important part of the story, but only part of the story. And so for me, I do tend to look more at this left-right dichotomy and say, if most of the stories that are telling us about friction in politics around the world, domestic politics around the world, are stories about increasing rights for some people and other people feeling that the rights are relatively less than they used to be, which is certainly something that we see happening in Canada. As we've talked about before, there are there are a surprising number of people who feel as though other people maybe shouldn't have equal rights to theirs. That is a transformation that is happening with some velocity, and definitely with some political consequences, which are the kinds of things that are revealed in this chart that you and I have been talking about, and the data set.
Okay, I want to move to another question that's sort of deep in your knowledge compartment, and that is polls in general, research in general. Because I mentioned this yesterday on the podcast. It's an Alberta election situation, the election in Alberta coming up in a couple of weeks now. But there were two polls within a period of a couple of days, both by reputable, well-known, well-respected polling operations. One is your old company at Abacus, and the other is the Janet Brown polling operation out of Calgary. And as I said, both are, are well respected.
Yeah.
But within a couple of days, they came out not with just different results, but dramatically different results. Abacus having the NDP ahead by a significant margin. I think it was, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it was like 7 or 8 points. And then Janet Brown's operation coming out within days with the opposite of that, even a wider lead for the Progressive Conservatives, Danielle Smith's party, over the NDP. And so what I said yesterday was I couldn't remember a time at which two major polling companies came out within, literally moments of each other with dramatically different results, and it led me to the conclusion that, one of them has to be wrong. They can't both be right when they're that different. How do you look at that situation?
Yeah, it does happen sometimes. The reason, people say the margin of error is X 19 times out of 20 is that there is that theoretical one time out of 20, although nobody really wants to kind of think about it exactly that way. And you're right. They can't both be right. When this happens, it's a nightmare for the pollsters because, when you do a survey, you trust your methodology and far, 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 far more times than not, what it delivers is accurate information. But there will be times that you'll see anomalous data. And, whenever in the 40 years or so that I've been in the business and there's you get an anomalous set of data, everybody goes, that's the end of it. Polling should go away and hide forever and bury itself and, bury its head in shame and never inject itself into our conversation again. And I understand that. But that's not likely to happen. And it probably shouldn't happen. It's just information, right? And some massive quantity, the overwhelming majority of it is pretty accurate and useful information, but every once in a while, something's wrong. So to your point about, well, what's the more accurate interpretation? If you have two polls and they're quite different and you come to the conclusion that they're at the same point in time measuring the same thing, which one is wrong? The only rule of thumb that I've ever found useful is to try to convince myself, what's my argument for believing data set A and what's my argument for believing data set B? And so in the case of the Alberta election, I'm looking at it and saying, and you're right, Janet Brown and David Coletto, both, among the most reputable pollsters in the country with a good track record of accuracy. So there's nothing there to look at in terms of the reliability and the trust that we can place in those two pollsters. So when I try to convince myself that Danielle Smith is winning this election, it's a short conversation with myself. I don't have an awful lot of things. If I try to kind of enumerate the things on the fingers of one hand, I only get about halfway through the hand. I just don't have that much to work with in trying to craft an argument that Danielle Smith has been winning this election campaign. If I try to do the opposite, it's kind of easy to see some reasons why the NDP might be doing better. That Danielle Smith has had a pretty rocky campaign. There are more questions being raised, even among conservatives, about her leadership. And that's not really happening with Rachel Notley. There does seem to be a sense that there's an unpredictability to the UCP under Danielle Smith. And that's the kind of thing that I think is making people feel like, maybe they made the wrong leadership choice, but let's just go ahead and elect them. Even if we think that's the case, is not a very strong argument, but it is one that you hear. And the last thing I would say is that I do follow the Alberta media about this. The Braids and others who write about Alberta politics and have done so for a long time. And I don't see a narrative developing in their work that says the UCP has put a great platform in front of people, is campaigning well. It is more apparent to me that they're kind of leaning in on the Danielle Smith's campaign is not everything that the UCP might have hoped that it would be. So I don't want to overemphasize that, because I really do believe that the right thing to do is to stress test both arguments and see where you come out. But where I come from in terms of what I've been consuming about this, I'd be a little bit more likely to believe the abacus numbers here. But the last point is you always got to wait for the next data set, because when you have two conflicting data points like this, the third is kind of a tiebreaker in terms of which is the more likely to be accurate result.
Well, if there's one thing you can be sure, with a couple of weeks left in the campaign, there are going to be more data sets coming out. So we can see that. It's just an interesting
Council also published the poll, I think, yesterday, which was a little bit more in line with the abacus results. So that's another factor for people to take into account. And I'm not cheerleading for abacus here, although I love David and the company and enjoy a continued association with it. I have nothing bad to say about Janet and her work. And but I do think that when you sort of stack up the pieces of data that sort of argue that the NDP is ahead, right now there seems to be a little bit more of that evidence for me.
Well, the one thing they agree on is that the fight is Calgary. It's all about Calgary and the way things will play out there. Let me ask you one more thing about those two polls. It's not really just about them. It's about polling in general. There are public opinion polls in the sense that they are for the public. They could be for a newspaper or for a university or what have you, and they're published that way. Then there are polls that are done for private clients, and you often don't know who that client is, but then they somehow leak out. Either the client leaks it or the pollster leaks it or somebody in between who is aware of the numbers leaks it. Should we look at either of those two differently, or should we look at the two sets of numbers differently if it was done with the intention of being made public or with the intention of being held privately by the client who paid for the data?
Well, I think it's always a good idea to be alert to the potential for those kinds of conflicts to happen. But that having been said, in a situation where you've got experienced, savvy pollsters putting election horse race data into the public marketplace, it would be very unusual for those kinds of companies or practitioners to put at risk their reputation in order to serve some other agenda. If somebody leaked an Acme poll tomorrow that said, that Rachel Notley's popularity had dropped by 20 points and nobody had ever heard of Acme, and you didn't know who paid for the poll, I would definitely agree with the hypothesis that should be treated with a little bit more hesitancy, maybe a lot more. Maybe I'm understating. But in a situation like this, it would seem to me quite unlikely that kind of thing would be a consideration. But it's definitely everybody should look at polls as information, and they should evaluate the information these days on the basis of a variety of factors. not just the fact that the number was published, but who did the work, maybe who paid for the work. What about the question design? Are there any other variables that we should look at? But I don't think that that's likely to be a problem in this particular case, but I think it's a question always that people should ask.
Okay, here's your last question for this week. You've been over there in the UK for a couple of weeks. You follow closely because it's your business to follow closely the situation in Canada, but you can't help from being there, also watching and being interested in what's happening in whether it's Scotland or England or Wales or Ireland or in Western Europe. Of the things you've been watching and paying some degree of attention to, are you learning any new lessons about modern day politics from watching how others are engaging in the process on that side of the Atlantic? Are you seeing anything new that either can apply here or could apply here?
That's a great question. I think that I am struck by the fact that the Conservatives nationally in the UK are, really underwater in the polls, right? They're way, way, way behind Labour. They've been in power for a good length of time. They've gone through a few different leaders, got a new one now. Those are in Rishi Sunak. Those are often conditions that lead to a staleness in the way in which a government kind of explains itself or campaigns or communicates. And I've been a little bit struck by how under Sunak, this government is able to get a message out that says, here's what we're going to do to fix the NHS waiting lists. Here's what we're going to do to fix some other bottleneck or public service problem that you're seeing. And in that sense, I don't feel like it's necessarily the most inventive thing I've ever seen, but it's the hardest thing for a long-serving incumbent government to do, which is to kind of craft that sense of we're going to improve upon our own record. And we're not going to spend our time talking about how good our record is, but how much emphasis we're putting on a new solution to change a current problem. I think it's a great lesson for incumbent governments everywhere, including in Canada's. So I have been noticing that. I don't know whether it will work. There could be such a degree of fatigue and mistrust for the UK Tories that it won't. But I see what they're trying, and I think that it's probably the right thing for them to try. The other thing, I guess, is it's really hard to tell right now, and maybe we can talk about it again in another week or so. But there does seem to be a different feeling around the Russia-Ukraine war. More sense that maybe Russia is kind of coming to a place where it needs to either push hard to win or it's going to lose. And I say that in part because I think the countries that are allied in support of Ukraine are starting to push more chips into the table. And you probably discussed this with Brian Stewart earlier this week or yesterday even. But I am seeing, plenty of evidence that this is, even if in the U.S. it's becoming a little bit more of a, Democrats versus Republicans, and the Republicans are saying, why should we even bother with this? I think in Europe, it's definitely kind of feeling like it's going in the other direction, where France and the UK and others are saying it's time for us to step up and add more ordnance and training and support for Ukraine to put a big push on it. And there is some evidence, to me anyway, that there's some fissures within the Russian side of things. That, again, I'm probably traveling a road that you and Brian went down much better.
You are a bit, but it's good to hear it from that perspective, from witnessing it from there. But you are in sync with what Brian was saying, and yet just yesterday, and there is a sense, Zelensky was just there in the UK, right, with Sunak, and it was exactly that. England was pushing, Britain was pushing more into the center of the table in terms of support for Ukraine and arms for Ukraine. But so was France and Germany. And that can make a difference. There is a sense, I think, somehow that we're reaching a point here where something is likely to happen over the next weeks or months in terms of bringing this to some form of conclusion, if only temporary. But we'll see. We've been surprised on this story ever since it started almost a year and a half ago now. We'll see what happens. But those are interesting observations. So let me leave you with this then. In your rush to go full Scotland, have you got the kilt on order or what?
Look, I'm lucky at this point to be able to get away with wearing a beard. It's coming under some pressure. We're going to see how long it lasts. I don't think I want to push my luck any more than that for the time being.
Oh, you have a beard? Or are you just starting? Or what's the idea?
I've got hair up here too.
All right, my friend. Good to talk to you. And you'll be back on Friday with Chantel for Good Talk. That's Bruce Anderson. Talking to us from the UK. Talking to us from beautiful Scotland. That's it for this day and for this week for Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth. Tomorrow it's your turn and the Random Ranter. Friday, Good Talk with Chantel and Bruce. I'm Peter Mansbridge. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you again in 24 hours.